The wind howled through the dark, empty streets, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. Snow piled in every corner, blanketing the world in silence. But hidden deep in a shadowy alley, a faint, fragile breath disturbed the stillness. A German shepherd lay motionless in the snow, his ribs pressed against his thin skin, his fur falling out in patches. He looked more shadow than dog, a lifeless shape blending into the icy ground. Passers-by walked past him without a glance, their footsteps fading into the night. He was dying, forgotten, and yet somewhere deep in his frail body, something kept him alive. A flicker of hope, small but unyielding. He clung to it, even as the snow tightened its grip. Then something changed. Footsteps echoed in the alley. A shadow appeared, drawing closer. For the first time in weeks, the dog's clouded eyes saw a hand reaching toward him. This is the story of survival, a story of compassion, and it all began with one person who refused to walk away. Max hadn't always been a shadow of himself. Once, not long ago, he had been the pride of a loving home. His world was filled with soft beds, warm meals, and a backyard where the sun kissed his shiny coat as he chased after balls. His family adored him. They called his name with laughter, and Max would run to them, tail wagging like a flag of joy. But one day things changed. The house was filled with boxes, and voices grew hurried. Max didn't understand what was happening. He sat by the door, watching his family pack up their lives. When they closed the door behind them for the last time, Max stayed there, waiting. For days his tail wagged every time he heard footsteps outside. But no one came. His food bowl stayed empty. His water froze in the cold. Hunger eventually drove Max out of the backyard. The streets greeted him with hostility. He wandered, his nose searching desperately for the scent of his family. But the streets were cruel. Store owners chased him away. Strangers yelled. A boy threw a rock at him, and the pain lingered long after the bruise had faded. The first snow fell, and Max's thin body couldn't fight the cold. His once thick fur fell out in patches, leaving his skin exposed to the biting wind. His ribs jutted out like fragile branches, his strength waning with every passing day. One night, Max collapsed in a dark alley. He curled into himself, his breath shallow and uneven. Snowflakes settled on his exposed skin. He couldn't move, couldn't fight anymore. People walked past him, their faces turned away, their footsteps fading into the distance. Max was invisible to them, yet somewhere deep inside him, something refused to let go. A faint flicker of hope, a memory of love, of warmth. It kept him alive, even as his body gave up. That flicker was waiting for someone to see him. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes with bitter winter nights. Sarah's boots crunched against the snow as she hurried home, her breath visible in the icy air. The wind bit at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her mind was crowded with thoughts of errands, bills, and the endless demands of life. She turned down a familiar street, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets. But something made her stop. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a motionless shape in the shadows of an alley. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. Was it a pile of trash? No, it was too deliberate, too still. She stepped closer, her boots breaking the silence. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw him, a dog curled tightly into himself, lying in the snow like a forgotten statue. His ribs jutted out painfully, his fur matted and sparse. He looked like he had been there for days. Sarah knelt down, her hands trembling. "Oh my God," she whispered. The dog didn't move. She thought for a moment that he was already gone. But then his eyes opened, barely. Their gazes met, and Sarah's chest tightened. His eyes were hollow, clouded with exhaustion and pain. But in the depths of that hollow gaze, there was something else, a flicker of hope. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice shaking. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." She reached out, her hand hovering over his frail body. His fur was raw in places, his body trembling uncontrollably. Poor thing, she thought, her throat tightening. Tears blurred her vision as she gently removed her scarf and draped it over him. The cold fabric barely made a difference, but it was all she had. Sarah pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking. She called the local animal shelter. "I found a dog," she said quickly. "He's in terrible shape. I don't think he can survive the night without help." The voice on the other end was calm but apologetic. "We're at capacity, but if you can bring him to us, we'll do what we can." Sarah glanced at the dog. His breathing was shallow, his chest barely rising and falling. She knew he wouldn't survive the trip, but she had no other choice. "I'll bring him," she said, her voice resolute. Sliding her arms under his frail body, Sarah lifted him gently. He whimpered softly but didn't resist. He was so light, so fragile, it felt as if he could break in her arms. "It's okay," she whispered, holding him close as she walked. "You're safe now. I've got you." The snow fell harder as she trudged toward her car. Each step felt heavier than the last, the cold biting at her face and fingers. But she didn't stop. When she reached the car, she carefully placed the dog on the back seat, wrapping him in a blanket. "Hang on, buddy," she murmured, glancing back at him through the rearview mirror as she started the engine. "We're almost there." The drive to the shelter felt like an eternity. Sarah's mind raced with worry. She couldn't bear the thought of this dog dying alone, abandoned by the world. As the shelter's warm lights came into view, she felt a spark of hope. "We're here," she whispered. "You're going to be okay." The shelter was quiet when Sarah arrived. The hum of a heater, the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. She parked her car and hurried to the back seat, where the dog lay motionless, wrapped in the blanket. His breathing was shallow, his ribs barely rising and falling. Carefully, Sarah lifted him again, cradling his fragile body close to her chest. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her boots crunched against the icy ground as she made her way to the shelter's entrance, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman with kind eyes stepped out to meet her. Her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as she saw the dog in Sarah's arms. "Oh my," the woman said, her hand flying to her chest. "He's in bad shape." Sarah nodded, her voice tight with urgency. "I found him in an alley. He's freezing, starving. He's barely holding on. Please, can you help him?" The woman motioned for Sarah to follow her inside. "Bring him back here. We'll do what we can." The warmth of the building enveloped them as they hurried down a hallway and into a small examination room. The walls were lined with shelves of medical supplies, and a steel table sat in the center under harsh fluorescent lighting. Sarah gently laid the dog on the table, her hands trembling as she pulled the blanket away from his body. He whimpered softly but didn't resist. His thin frame looked even more fragile under the bright lights. Within moments, a man in scrubs entered the room, a vet with a calm but serious demeanor. He knelt beside the dog, his hands moving methodically as he checked his vitals. "He's severely malnourished," the vet muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Dehydrated, hypothermic, but he's still breathing. That's a good sign." Sarah stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She felt helpless as she watched the vet work, attaching an IV line to the dog's leg to deliver fluids. The dog let out a faint whimper, but didn't fight. "Is he going to make it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The vet glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's too soon to say. He's in critical condition, but he's a fighter. He must be to have survived this long. We'll do everything we can." Sarah nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. She wanted to do more, to somehow take away the pain this dog had endured. But all she could do now was wait and hope. For the next hour, the vet and his team worked tirelessly. They cleaned the dog's wounds, examined him for signs of infection, and adjusted the IV drip to provide the nutrients he so desperately needed. Sarah stayed by his side the entire time, her hand resting gently on his head. "You're going to be okay," she whispered softly. "You're safe now. I promise." Finally, the vet stepped back and sighed. "He's stable for now," he said, "but the next 24 hours will be critical." "Can I stay with him?" Sarah asked immediately. The vet hesitated, then nodded. "You can stay. Sometimes having someone close by can make a difference." Sarah pulled up a chair and sat beside the table. She reached out and stroked the dog's fur, her fingers brushing against his exposed ribs. He was so fragile, so broken, but in his eyes she saw the faintest spark of life. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. "We'll get through this together." The first night was agonizingly slow. Sarah sat beside the dog, watching his chest rise and fall in slow, shallow breaths. She spoke to him softly, telling him about the warm home she dreamed of giving him, about sunny days and safe places. When the first rays of dawn broke through the shelter windows, Sarah noticed something small but significant. The dog's breathing was a little stronger, his body a little warmer. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope. Over the next few days, the shelter became a second home for Sarah. She visited the dog every morning before work and every evening after, sitting with him for hours on end. The shelter staff admired her dedication, though some worried about her growing attachment. The dog, now named Max, began to show small signs of improvement. His body slowly adjusted to the nutrients and fluids provided by the vet. His breathing steadied, and the dullness in his eyes began to lift. The first time Max sniffed Sarah's hand, she nearly cried. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. For days he had been too weak, too scared to acknowledge her presence. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to trust her. "You're such a brave boy," she whispered, kneeling beside him. She gently brushed her fingers over his fur, careful to avoid the raw patches of skin. "I'm so proud of you." Max leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. It was the first time she had seen him relax, even for a moment. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when Max's fear resurfaced. A sudden noise or a stranger entering the room would cause him to cower, his body trembling as memories of his past overwhelmed him. Sarah hated seeing him like that, but she understood. Healing wasn't linear, and Max had endured more than any dog should. She was determined to be patient with him, no matter how long it took. One evening, as Sarah sat beside him, Max did something that took her breath away. He shifted closer to her, his movements slow and deliberate. Then, with a soft sigh, he rested his head on her lap. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she looked down at him. "You trust me, don't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I promise I'll never let you down." Max's eyes met hers, and in that moment, she felt an unspoken connection between them. His trust was clear, and for Sarah, it was the greatest gift he could have given her. By the end of the week, the vet delivered incredible news. Max was strong enough to leave the shelter. His recovery was far from over, but he no longer needed constant medical supervision. "I'll take him," Sarah said immediately, her voice firm. "He belongs with me." The vet smiled, handing her a folder of instructions for Max's care. "I had a feeling you'd say that." As Sarah walked out of the shelter that evening, Max by her side, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Together, they were embarking on a new chapter, one filled with challenges, but also with hope. The drive home was quiet except for the soft hum of the car engine. Max sat in the back seat, bundled in a thick blanket Sarah had brought for him. His tired eyes gazed out of the window, blinking slowly as the world passed by. Occasionally, he glanced at Sarah through the rearview mirror. Sarah couldn't help but smile. "Almost there, Max," she said softly. "This is your fresh start." Her small house sat on the edge of town, surrounded by a grove of trees that stood bare in the crisp winter air. Snow lined the driveway as Sarah parked and got out. Opening the back door, she crouched beside Max. "Ready?" she whispered, holding out her hand. Max hesitated. His thin legs trembled as he stepped cautiously onto the icy ground. For a moment he froze, staring up at the house as if he couldn't believe it was meant for him. "It's okay," Sarah said, her voice gentle. "This is your home now." Max tilted his head slightly, his eyes full of curiosity and caution. Then slowly he stepped forward. Together they walked toward the front door, Sarah keeping a reassuring hand on his side. Inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around them like a blanket. A soft dog bed sat in the corner of the living room, along with a set of new bowls and toys. The fire crackled gently in the fireplace, casting a golden glow across the room. Max's paws slid slightly on the hardwood floor as he entered, his nose twitching as he sniffed the unfamiliar space. He moved cautiously, as if expecting something to go wrong. Sarah stayed a few steps behind, giving him the space he needed. She knew it would take time for him to feel safe. "Take your time," she said softly. "There's no rush." Max wandered into the living room, stopping in front of the dog bed. He sniffed it carefully, then glanced back at Sarah, as if asking for permission. She smiled, her heart swelling with affection. "It's yours, Max," she said. "All of this is yours." Max lowered himself onto the bed slowly, his movements stiff and hesitant. But once he settled, he let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing for the first time. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand brushing gently over his fur. "You're safe now," she whispered. "You don't have to worry anymore." Over the next few days, Max began to adjust to his new surroundings. It wasn't easy. Loud noises made him flinch, and sudden movements left him trembling. But Sarah was patient. She never raised her voice, never pushed him too far. Instead, she offered quiet affection, letting him come to her on his own terms. Each morning, Sarah took Max outside for short walks. The cold air seemed to invigorate him, though his legs were still weak and his pace slow. She kept him close, speaking softly to reassure him. One morning, as they walked through the grove of trees behind the house, Max surprised her. He stopped suddenly, his ears perking up as he caught sight of a squirrel darting through the snow. For a moment, he seemed like a completely different dog. His tail gave a small wag, and his body tensed, not with fear, but with excitement. Sarah laughed. "Max, are you chasing squirrels now?" It was a small moment, but it filled Sarah with hope. Max was beginning to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Max did something that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. He rested his head on her lap, letting out a deep, contented sigh. "You're my brave boy," she whispered, stroking his fur gently. "And I'm so proud of you." The road to recovery was anything but smooth. Though Max was adjusting to his new life, the shadows of his past still lingered, creeping into the quiet moments like an unwelcome visitor. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in. The wind howled and rain lashed against the windows, rattling them in their frames. Sarah sat by the fire, sipping tea when she noticed Max stir. At the first crack of thunder, his entire body tensed. His ears flattened against his head, and his eyes widened with fear. Within seconds, he bolted upright, his breathing rapid and shallow. "Max," Sarah said softly, setting down her cup and kneeling beside him. "It's okay. It's just a storm." But Max didn't hear her. He was trapped in a memory, his body trembling as if he were back on the streets, cold and alone. Sarah reached out slowly, her hand brushing against his fur. "You're safe," she whispered. "I'm here. You're not alone." For a moment, she feared he would retreat completely, shutting her out like he had in the early days. But then, something remarkable happened. Max turned his gaze to her, his wide, panicked eyes locking with hers. Slowly, tentatively, he stepped closer, pressing his head against her chest. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as his trembling began to subside. "That's it, buddy," she murmured. "I've got you." It was a breakthrough, a sign that Max was beginning to trust her on a deeper level. But it also reminded Sarah of how deeply his scars ran, not just on his body, but on his soul. Over the next few days, Sarah worked on helping Max feel more secure. She left a radio on when she went out, its soft music filling the house with a comforting presence. During storms, she sat with him by the fire, her calm energy helping him weather the fear. One afternoon, Sarah decided to take Max to the park. It was a quiet, snowy day, and the paths were nearly empty. She wanted him to experience the world beyond the walls of her home, to learn that it wasn't always a place of fear and pain. Max stayed close to her side, his leash loose in her hand. He sniffed at the snow, his tail wagging faintly as he explored the unfamiliar scents. For the first time, Sarah saw a glimpse of the dog he was meant to be, a dog full of curiosity and life. But as they rounded a corner, a jogger came running toward them, his footsteps crunching loud on the frozen path. Max froze, his body stiffening as his ears flattened against his head. Sarah felt the tension in the leash and immediately knelt beside him. "It's okay, Max," she said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. "He's not going to hurt you." The jogger slowed, noticing Max's fear, and gave them a wide berth. Sarah waited until he passed, then gently stroked Max's fur. "You're okay," she said. "You're safe." Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Then slowly he relaxed. His tail gave a small wag, and Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You're so brave," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I knew you could do it." By the time they returned home, Max seemed calmer, more at ease. He curled up on his bed by the fire, his body stretched out in a way that showed he was finally beginning to feel comfortable in his own skin. Sarah smiled as she watched him. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said softly. Max glanced up at her, his eyes warm and trusting. In that moment, she knew they would face every challenge together. As the harsh grip of winter loosened, the snowbanks that had once lined the streets melted into streams. Tiny buds appeared on the trees, marking the first signs of spring. For Max, it wasn't just the change of seasons. It was the start of a new chapter in his life. Each morning, Sarah and Max walked through the forested trails near her home. The once frail dog who could barely stand now trotted beside her, his tail wagging with every step. His fur, though still patchy in places, had begun to grow back in soft, healthy layers of brown. But the most remarkable change was in his eyes. They sparkled with curiosity and warmth, a far cry from the hollow gaze Sarah had first seen in that dark alley. One sunny afternoon, Sarah decided it was time to take a big step. They were at the park, a wide-open field stretching out before them. Max sniffed the air, his tail wagging faintly. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his collar. "Max," she said softly, looking into his eyes, "I think you're ready for this." Slowly, she unhooked the leash. For a moment, Max froze, his body tense as he glanced around. Then, as if realizing he was truly free, he took off. His paws kicked up small clouds of dirt as he ran in wide circles, his movements full of energy and joy. He stopped occasionally to sniff at flowers or chase a butterfly, his tail wagging furiously. Each time he turned back to Sarah, as if checking to make sure she was still there. Sarah laughed, tears of pride and happiness streaming down her face. "You're amazing, Max," she called, clapping her hands. Max bounded back toward her, his eyes shining. When he reached her, she knelt down and wrapped her arms around him. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice trembling. In that moment, Max wasn't just a dog. He was a survivor, a fighter, and most importantly, he was family. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Max and Sarah returned home. The warmth of the fireplace greeted them as they stepped inside. Max curled up on his favorite spot by the fire, letting out a deep, contented sigh. Sarah sat nearby, watching him with a smile. Her fingers absent-mindedly stroked his fur as she reflected on their journey together. It had been months since she'd found him, frail and broken in that snowy alley. She could hardly believe the transformation, both in Max and in herself. "You saved me just as much as I saved you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Max's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at her with pure trust. His tail gave a soft wag, as if to say, "I know." Though Max still had moments of fear, they grew fewer with each passing day. He was learning to trust, to feel safe, and to enjoy life again. And for Sarah, Max had become more than a pet. He was her companion, her inspiration, her family. Their story was proof of the power of second chances. It showed that with patience, love, and compassion, even the most broken souls could heal. As Sarah leaned back and closed her eyes, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The world outside might still hold its challenges, but as long as they had each other, they could face anything. Max was no longer the forgotten dog she had found in the snow. He was a survivor, a fighter, and a testament to the resilience of the spirit. And this was just the beginning of their beautiful new chapter together. Max's journey from the brink of death to finding a loving home reminds us all of the power of compassion and second chances. His story is proof that every life matters and that love can transform even the most broken souls into survivors. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it with someone who loves inspiring tales of hope and resilience. Together, we can spread the message that kindness can change lives.